Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, coaches, from whichever part of the world you're logging in. Welcome to the 2019 Gallup Learning Series, our fifth year running. My name is Saurav Atri, and on behalf of the learning team, thank you for joining us today. We are really excited to have you join us for this week of learning offered exclusively for you, our Gallup certified strengths coaches. For the purpose of this call today, we encourage you to refer to page 11 of your participant guide for today's session. This session will also be recorded, just like the other ones, so you can do catch it a second time around if you want to reference the session again. From an ICF perspective, this session has also been approved by the ICF for core competency training hours for those attending it live. I will provide you more information along with Jim for obtaining those credits at the end of the session today as well. We would love to hear your questions. We want to make this as interactive as possible for our guests via the chat feature on the screen. It's a rolling chat, so keep throwing your questions in. We'll see how many we can cover today. Please, as we go along the day, throw in your insights, questions on the chat function. I'm really excited to introduce today's guests with us today. We have two of them with Therese Nisbet. She's an ACC coach with ICF. Also at Gallup, she's a talent management senior practice consultant. Her top five strengths are individualization, woo, maximizer, relator, and achiever. Therese has been with Gallup since 1983, and she's listened to, consulted with, and played a major role in helping individuals, organizations, leaders grow and develop in the area of their expertise and her expertise. We talk about building expertise in the world, those 10,000 hours. Well, she's got 10,000 hours of coaching experience behind her. So you can actually, we can learn a lot from her experiences today. Her mission in life is to discern the uniqueness of the manager and leaders with whom she consults, and then help them gain insights into and develop strategies on how to lead with their strengths. So we look forward to hearing from Therese as well today. Our second guest for today is Jillian Anderson. She's a consulting specialist, a senior consultant. Her top five strengths themes are achiever, input, learner, belief, and responsibility. And as a senior consultant with Gallup, she specializes in organizational change management. She advises leading global clients on strategies to apply customers and employee engagement and strength-based development to affect comprehensive organizational involvement. I've seen some of Jillian's work globally, and she's truly been an inspiration and global consultant within Gallup, but most importantly, what I call change management for large organizations worldwide, and especially working with teams there as well. She coaches executives one-to-one and managers at client organizations, essentially through the whole strength-based management philosophy, creating engaging teams, and building engaged customer relationships as well. So today, both Therese and Jillian will bring their insights and wisdom and experiences to share and have recommendations for using the new Clifton Strengths Finder 34 report within the context of a team setting. Thank you both for joining us today. We're really excited to learn from you. I personally am really excited to learn from both of you as well. And we'd love to hear, just with the team grid, even before you enter a conversation with a team or a leader on the team grid, how do you even start? What's the thought process like? So, Jillian, we'd love to get you started with just kind of sharing your thought process there.
Oh, I'd be happy to share. And thanks for the kind words and the setup, Saurav. And, I've got to say, my belief in connectedness just get excited when I think about connecting with this entire global coaching community right now, too. And if you can tell, I'm actually sitting right now in a hotel room in Dallas, Texas, and I'm leading a strength certification course for one of our client organizations this week. And those of you who've been through the strengths coaching certification before, you know that today, Thursday, is the day that we're talking about teams, we're talking about managers. And so this topic is right in line with everything we've been thinking about. And as you mentioned, Saurav, I've had the opportunity with a number of organizations to not only use the new Clifton Strengths 34 report, but to use it in the context of teams. And to me, that's when it's exciting, is when we get to bring this to life. Think of the statistic that we share about 70% of your experience with your organization really comes down to that local team experience. And so your engagement is heavily, heavily impacted by the people you're working beside every day, the manager or leader that you work for. And so the work that we get to do as coaches, working with teams has an incredible ripple effect. So for me, if we kind of chunk even this learning series in terms of thinking about what does the effective preparation process look like for working with a team around their strengths, what does it look like when we think about leading an effective team session, and what does that effective follow-up look like as well? In that preparation process, for me, I've actually got input and learner, as you said, in my own top 5. And so that preparation process is always something I take very seriously. And for me, I actually see it as a form of honor and respect when we show up really well prepared for that conversation. And you actually have in your participant guide for this session a few different tips that both Teresa and I have found very effective in our preparation process. And I think the first thing is simply just pulling back before we even get into the report and thinking about who is this team? Who are they as individuals? Who are they as a collective? And why are they even asking me to work with them? So even thinking of some of my own recent examples, a couple weeks ago, I was working with an executive team within a client organization that we do engagement work with. And as we were looking at the engagement results for their entire organization, this was a leadership team that's already done some work around strengths before, and they said, you know what, let's incorporate some strengths conversation about who we are as a team and how we're leading this engagement strategy within our organization. And so I look at an opportunity like that. And what we ended up doing, even with the new CliftonStrengths 34 report, is we did one-on-ones with each of those leaders before we came into the room. And those one-on-ones ended up being the opportunity for us to go much deeper into all of the robust aspects of what that report brings. And for them, they were incredibly excited. They had done top 5 before, but it was an opportunity for them to get some new insights on even what their potential blind spots might be, understand some of the nuances of how their strengths show up. And then when we were able to get into the room together, I knew with a group like that we had to be pretty quick hitting, and it wasn't an opportunity for us to go deep into the report in that room together. They had done that before our time. That time in the room ended up being talking about those collective strengths coming together. And that might look different than if I'm working with, let's say, another example that I have is working with one of our regional managers with a bank, and they're trying to drive customer engagement scores with their team. And so they said, hey, we want to do some strengths work around this. And so they've already done some strengths before, but they're really trying to intentionally aim it at driving this customer experience. And so that's more than a one-time conversation with this team. That really is some in-depth. We spent about a day with that team going in-depth into their strengths, intentionally making those connections with customer engagement. So for me, a lot of that is just thinking about how do we start with consider who this team is, consider who they are as individuals and as a team. And then from there, if you're kind of tracking with us on the participant guide, that's then once I've answered that question of why do they want me here, that's when I can start to think about what's the right things for me to focus on with this team. And how do I have a better understanding of who they actually are as I'm looking at their team grid? And, we talk about this in the certification course, but if you are looking at a team grid, for me, I do a lot just marking that baby up. And so I'm writing on there. I'm looking for, what are some of the commonalities when I say, what does this team lead with? Which domains are most frequent for that team? So where do they have the heaviest weight for their own strengths? And which ones are not coming as naturally to them? So I look at it from that domain perspective. I also go through and I mark up very clearly where any individuals bring unique contributions. And this is where I think that full 34 lens actually gives you a much more robust conversation. If you're only seeing that top 5, you get a picture of the team, but you really see so much more when you're starting to bring in that additional even 6 through 10 when you're looking at what individuals contribute. And that to me sets up a very powerful conversation. Then from there, I'm bringing it back to, what is this team's purpose behind it? I can remember one session in particular that I was working with a client that it was an account team with this client that came together and had met with the leader beforehand. And the leader said, you know what, one of the things we intentionally want to focus on as a team is we're really good at kind of executing on what's expected of us, but we are in a spot where we need to learn and grow our business in new ways. And so knowing that going into that conversation then made what we were looking at in that team grid, gave it a new lens for how we were looking specifically at what we wanted to get out of our time together. So then from there, kind of knowing all of that, if you're tracking with me, that fourth thing that we've got as a tip on here, that's then when I start writing those open-ended questions, because I now have an understanding of what's our aim during our time together. Who is this team? What are they all about? How much time do we even have together? And that's where, for me, one of the things that I found helpful, I'll literally go just domain by domain. And if this is helpful for a process for those who are listening in, I'll just write, one question that stands out to me that really gets them to explore their strength in a specific domain. So, for example, if I take one of the recent team grids that I was looking at before this, it was a team that, if I look under the executing domain, had high arranger in the top 5, right? So a simple question might be, how does this team's ability to orchestrate help it be successful in the work that you're doing? And so that might just be a question we could explore together. But it was also a team that had high achiever, responsibility, lower focus. And so then I'll ask one question underneath of that domain, or prepare one question that I feel like is getting at a bit more of a potential blind spot for that team. So in that kind of a situation, it was saying, hey, how does this team prioritize the most important work that you need to be focusing on as a team? And so I'll just do that domain by domain. I don't necessarily always get to those in the team session, but for my own thought process of knowing where that team's got opportunity to play to their strengths, where they've got things that they might need to be watching out for, I find that is the effective preparation that sets me up for a really robust conversation with the team. And then finally there, and I know Therese can add more with this part as well, but obviously, wherever we have the opportunity, we like that chance to be able to talk with the manager beforehand, just to solidify, what does success look like when we're spending our time with this team? What is that clear aim walking out of here? And giving that manager the opportunity to see how their own strengths even interact with the team. I'm often asking in that conversation, tell me about what do you see your team being best at? What's some of your current challenges that you're facing? What's your clear aim walking out of here? One other tip that I'll just give in preparation, and then I'd love to have Therese even chime in here too. But one other tip for folks, when you think about all those tools that you get as a coach, one of the things that I've done is taken those really simple insights cards that we get. And if you think about a team really being that collective, almost a profile of a person, right? So you kind of take that team and make it one person. I'll take the 5 most intense talent themes on that team, and I'll pull out those insight cards. And what I do is just write across those insight cards, I'll look at what that team loves, what they hate, what they bring, what they need, and actually write those statements out so that I walk in there with almost a brand statement around that team. And I've got a good understanding, some good language to be able to use to start to understand collectively how that team shows up. And I found that something that's incredibly powerful in my preparation process that taps into the tools that this entire community has access to.
Thank you, Jillian. I'm going to build on that and sort of, Therese, I would like to pull you in and just kind of what, Jillian said about that one-to-one conversation with the manager is so critical even before we enter a team conversation, right? What tools do you use in that conversation? What's your approach? What questions do you typically start with that conversation with the manager on, Therese?
It's one of those things where I find it just really easy to ask the manager to tell me their story. It's really that easy, because I think if we can get them talking, if we can get them to really just say from beginning to end, what is happening in your world? Why are we having this team session? What's the good, the bad, and the ugly around some of those things that are important to not only the manager and the team? To Jillian's point, I think the more conversations we can have as we think about the dynamic of teams. So understanding not only the lens of the manager, but if we can then talk to the members of the team, I'll take 15 minutes. That's a bonus. I'll take 30. I'll take 45. I'll take whatever they'll give me, especially if they haven't had strengths feedback. That's really, to me, a critical part of a team session, that they really do need to have had some feedback before that session. but if I can hear the lens from not only the manager, but each member of the team, it really gives me a broader scope around where everybody's sitting. I love what you said, Jillian, where I do feel like I walk into a team session with real clear thinking around what I believe. So I ponder, I wonder, I think about, and I really do go in with some notions around what do I think I will see. And part of the fun of the conversations then is to have them, do I hear them saying what I believe they are? And really just move them sometimes in those directions, because sometimes it's safer to talk to me and Jillian and even you as a coach than it might be to speak out loud in the broader group. So those conversations, while confidential, I say to them, I may throw some interesting questions on the table, not about he said, she said, but some interesting questions where, as we think about the group as in total, how do you manage through conflict? If that was something I heard or something even the manager wanted them to discuss, I've already got some thoughts around how they do that. And so if I hear them circling the block a lot, I may say, so let me ask this. And I might ask something more pointed, where we have two strong personalities in the room that tend to be in disagreement. How does the rest of the team feel about that? Those kinds of things, to really just push some things onto the table if I need to.
So you said a great question around what's your story when you're talking to the manager. What questions do you have when you talk to team members? What are you asking them, and also what are you listening for?
I always ask them, what do they love about what they do? What challenges do they see? Anything that I should know about the framework of the team that they would feel comfortable telling me? How collaborative do they feel within the group? Do they feel like they're an integral part of the team? I had someone told me one time during our conversation she was definitely the outlier of the team and felt like she was disliked. Interesting. So put that in my pocket to see if that came out in the team session and how we could. I actually asked her if she would like me to, in some form or fashion, put that on the table. And she said yes, in a general sort of way. So it's those kinds of things I'd like to understand about the dynamics. Some of those are really hard in teams to talk about. And I think when we sit with them, we feel safe for them to have safe conversations, because I think part of that starting a team session is level setting the roadmap around what we're doing today. I typically don't have the manager do that, because I don't want them to think the manager, this is the rules of the manager. I typically say, I'm here to just stimulate conversation, thoughts, thinking. It's okay for us to disagree. It's okay for us to have things that we don't believe the same. But how do we resolve that in a way that's productive and that we get to the end result, whatever it is we're solving for?
And in that conversation, the manager, how do you set expectations? What do you tell them? What do you encourage them? What roles do they play? And also the team members, what would you say there?
I must say that on a lot of these team sessions, I will know the manager pretty well. There have been times I've told the manager I would like him to refrain from taking over the conversation, and that I will cue him or take a time out if that's not happening, because part of the idea is that everyone feels comfortable having a perspective. So when we have a really strong manager, and when you look at the rest of the team and appreciate that they all tend to be agreeable rather than confident expressing a differing point of view, I've even said to them, so how often do you get disagreement on the team? And if the manager's telling me, oh, we don't disagree, it tells me that it's an interesting thing for me to talk to each individual member of the team before the session and how they feel about that dynamic. Because my guess is they're probably talking outside of the team meetings that they have rather than inside the team meetings. So a lot of times the manager, some of that might be what he wants to get is people have a more robust point of view without really him understanding that part of the reason they're not is because of him. Or I may say to a manager that's really collaborative, a lot of times they're a little bit frustrated with those strong personalities in the room. They feel like they're constantly pushing the wrong buttons or pushing and striving towards, disagreement. So some of that is just an understanding of where the manager is and really what he or she might want me to make sure we discuss in the team session. Plus, I may tell him some thoughts I have based on his own strengths, where we might want to go.
And Therese, like you mentioned, some of the things it takes for us to get to that point needs a safe environment to be created for people to have this open conversation. So, Jillian, I want to hear from you. How do you even enter a team conversation? So, after you've had this one-to-one conversation, how do you create that safe environment? How do you even start?
Yeah, you know what? I'll actually give folks a really easy thing you can go back to. So if you think back to your own training, one of the things we talk about were just those simple guiding principles that we hold to as coaches. And so things like, themes are neutral and differences are advantages. Even starting with some ground rules, and you heard Therese even talk about that too, of, hey, you know what, here's how we think about this, right? And I think there's even some language that you can use. I know we have a number of ICF folks or folks with ICF background who are joining us here too. And you think about, it's no different than a one-on-one coaching agreement where you're helping somebody realize that this is a safe space. And even saying that up front of, hey, this is a safe space where we want to welcome people sharing in this room, and where, what gets talked about in this room, here's kind of our rules of the road of how we're talking about this team, right? That we're recognizing differences and advantages. We're not using things as labels. We're intentionally looking for the positive in each other. And then I think back to even what Therese was talking about there too, we can be powerful in playing that role. Any of us, as we're brought in as kind of that, outside of the team facilitator for that conversation. But I also think there's a powerful component of how we are teeing up that leader to set up the session as well. And so we can say those things, but that leader even giving some of that message from their own personal perspective at the beginning can carry a lot of weight with that team. And, to what Therese even talked about there, maybe it's from some of your pre-conversations, Sharav. I know, you just actually came off of one of these today where we're doing a pre-session for a team meeting you have coming up. And some of the things that you even agreed about with that leader, this may be their opportunity to say, hey, you know what? I chatted with Therese, I chatted with Jillian, and here's a couple of the things that I've been thinking of that I want to be mindful of for today, and what I want to kind of invite in this space. I want to invite that pushback. I'm going to be a little bit quieter than usual, or perhaps on the other side of things, I'm going to take an active participative role today because I want to make sure that, I'm a part of kind of you're getting to kind of hear where I'm coming from with this team as well. So based on what you've talked about leading into that team session.
And typically, how long do these team sessions last for you? Like, the duration of these?
Mine can lead anywhere from 2 hours to the full day. It just depends on the team.
Yeah, and I would say similar here. It's anywhere, and oftentimes if it gets connected with something else. So take, for example, the engagement conversation that I mentioned. You're maybe spending an hour on strengths and then really getting into engagement results. Some of that depends what level you're working with in an organization, anywhere up to, I've had similar as Therese, where you've got a full day with folks. And that's always a gift to us, right? Because you get to go so much deeper in that time.
So as you think about some of the best sessions you both would have done, and I'll start with Therese first. Therese, what would that journey look like for people? In the Strengths Finder world and team coaching, we talk about the whole name it, claim it, aim it, teamwork journey for new coaching teams. What journey did you take them on, and what did that look like for some of your best training sessions and team sessions?
So I typically start with feel good. So we'll think of there's lots of fun activities that I think about. It's just so dependent on the team and how big the team is. So I may do as simple as throw little white pieces of paper on the middle of the table that are just, and we pick one, and it's, what's a strength you really love about yourself? What would you love to see that your team do more of? What's the biggest challenge your team is facing? So that we already start having a conversation, but it's safe because they have one little question they have to ask. The other thing I sometimes do is tell me something that you really feel that you do really well. They don't have to really say, gee, I'm responsible, but behaviorally, what do you think you add to the team? And then I say, and now I'd like you to look around and tell someone what you wish you could buy from them, that they do something different from you. So I may say to Jillian, would you please sell me your input, because I have done, and I would love to have that talent because. So some of those kind of safe conversations that get people talking to each other, collaborating with each other, feeling safe in the conversation. So I always start there doing that. And part of those conversations, we typically will whiteboard some of the things people are saying, because we want to start to have a starting point as you think about even that whole list of 34. What are we hearing from people in behavior language, so that we can reference back to that as we start thinking about now what? So we don't immediately rush to look at the team grid. It's really more that conversation around with the group. And the larger the group is, and really depending on what the talent, the strengths of the group look like, I may break a larger group down into smaller teams in the beginning to have that conversation. So if I'm sitting there with 12 people and I know that we have two really influential and a whole lot of lovely other people in the room, I might have them get into the 3 groups of 4 and just look at the board and think, so where are we great? You know, what do we want to work on more? What are some of the things that we really struggle with? What are we known for? What's our brand? Whatever conversation and whatever questions I had sort of formulated as I talked to the people before the session. So we start going then through that and talking more through that before we actually hand them the team grid. And along that line, as we're looking at the rhythm of the board, we're thinking more about, so looking at this, what's our objective for the day? We really define that. I may even say in the group, think about together what you would like to accomplish in the day. And we may come up with 3 different things from the group that we'll put on the board and really go through that one by one and think, how do we then move intentionally through that? And then it really just takes on a life of its own. It's the fun part for you coaches that have done it before of team sessions. You can plan, you can think, you can prepare, you can have questions, and then all of a sudden you're on Jupiter and you have no idea how you got there, but it's really fun being on Jupiter.
So, Jillian, how do you have fun in a team session, and how do you create that environment for people to sort of, be more candid and open?
First of all, I just have to say, I love these sessions right here because we're getting to learn from each other. I'm going, oh, that's a fantastic idea. I love, Therese, just that takeaway of, being able to kind of buy someone else's strengths. What would you get? And I think that's kind of a creative way to get it at something like a love, crazy envy, and, where you can have admiration for somebody else and that kind of recognition that you can even drive with a team. So for me, Saurav, I bring it back to some of what you actually just said at the beginning, kind of thinking about that name, claim, aim model. And if you think about the progression, I think, Therese, you do this too. We're often thinking about individual first, then team. Right. And so I do similar to Therese, where I usually have something that's kind of an introduction to strengths at the beginning, and whether that's the stand-up exercise or, depending on your size of group and depending on how much exposure they've had to strengths before that. But that gets them excited. And I meant to mention earlier, too, usually when that leader sets the tone, it is also saying, what they want that aim for the day to be. So that's kind of, at the very beginning, then moving into some of those ground rules, then kind of getting into establishing that, foundation of really what strengths is about, getting people excited about it. Then I move into something that gives them the opportunity to focus on individuals in the team, right? And I've done some creative things around that. In fact, I worked with one group within Gallup where one of the things that, they'd done a lot of work with strengths already. And so it was trying to kind of think of some things a little different from our normal activities. And so I actually had them each bring in an object that they felt like represented their strengths. Mm-hmm. And I tell you, the having a visual image of something that just sticks with you. I still remember one of the individuals who was on the team had high focus and positivity, and she brought in a little Thomas the Train engine, that was like, I think I can. I'm the person who keeps us on track and, gives people the encouragement they need to move forward. And something like that just kind of allowed people to maybe in a different way show how their own strengths were brought to the table. And then I think from there, that's where we then make the transition to start to move into the team. I do it similar to Therese in terms of thinking about who the team is, but I can give a couple maybe specific tactics for ideas around this. For me, I want to get that team thinking about who they are and how they show up before we even show any data to them, right? And then when they see the data, they're going, oh, that's right. I kind of connect all the dots here. And so one of the fun ways that I do that is I'll just say with the team, hey, you know what? If I was going to do a focus group with all of the people that you interact with and work with, your peers inside of this organization. Maybe if it's a customer facing group, I say, I'm going to put your clients in there too. If we want to get, crazy about it, maybe we even segment in case we think there's any brand differences between those. But I'll say, I'm going to pull all those people into the room. You're not going to be in here. And I'm just going to ask them how you show up as a team, and for them to give me some adjectives, right? What do they love about you? What do they get frustrated about? And what that does is it allows you, I use the same technique in one-on-one coaching, but it allows them to kind of third person themselves, if that makes sense. And it creates a little bit of safety for kind of looking at themselves from the outside in and thinking about how they show up to the rest of the world. And what's interesting with that is, I can think of a specific example where, a team said, you know what, we're known as the get her done team in the organization. People know they can come to us, but, and then I'll usually start with that brand. But I'll also ask, as a team, where do you experience challenges? And that same team said, man, we just experience a lot of challenge with burnout, right? And so as we then pulled the team grid in front of us, and this, I already know all this from my preparation. And so I'm kind of anticipating some of this. And so then you pull that team grid in front of you, and what you start to realize as a team is, wow, look at all of our strong executing strengths. Do we see how that allows us to show up in a way that people know that when they give us something, we get it done and we even go the extra mile? But do we also see how maybe that even contributes to us feeling a little pulled thin, and how do we manage, what we're saying yes and no to as a result of that? So that's been helpful. If I kind of think about that, name is, focus on the individual, claim kind of gets into that brand of the team. Studying some of their own successes. That's where I bring in some of those questions that I prepared beforehand. And then even with that aim piece, that's where we can get into, pretty clear discussion if that manager's even posed a very specific aim for that group. And then at the end, we played with a couple different things. I've done something as simple as a start, stop, continue at the end. Mm-hmm. And that can kind of help get to a place of what's next, right? So we can have a lot of fun kind of exploring who we are, but how do we actually take that and apply it? I've also done something where I'm kind of known in when I work with groups, I like circling people up. And so oftentimes at the end of a team session, I'll say, hey, you know what? We're going to just stand up, think about everything that we've talked about today, right? And let's think about what is one slight shift you personally can commit to that's going to help this team live as more of a strengths-based team. Either something you contribute, something that you need to lead a little bit differently around, lean into, help manage with this team. And that kind of level of commitment of walking out of there, hearing that from one another, can just kind of help solidify what some of those even personal actions are coming out of that session.
Mm-hmm. If you think about the slight shifts you talked about, Julian, what insights do you create in people's minds that helps them reframe and helps them create those internalization of those slight shifts? How do you achieve those outcomes of that shift in their minds?
Yeah, I think a lot of that are the exact same techniques that we use in one-on-one coaching, right? Mm-hmm. It's just that the difference here is you're getting them to think about it in the context of the collective. So it's now that, I may be talking about, take us right here as kind of real examples. I may be saying, I have a lot of input. I like preparing myself. But what I realize as I'm working with the team is, oh, you know what? I have a lot of resources, but I didn't realize that this team actually feels like they could benefit from some of my resources, And so I may make a point that I want to intentionally share some of what I am learning or great tools that I'm using or things like that. So it's oftentimes that kind of collision, I would say, of someone understanding their own personal talents, but challenging them to think differently about, now that I'm thinking about it in the context of a team, what do I need to bring to this team? And that's actually where I know a number of us are familiar with the best of me exercise, but that's also another great one when you're thinking about kind of closing out a team session, because it gets you to take it from who am I to what can I bring to this team and what does this team need to know about me so that we're making it stronger as a whole.
And Therese, I'm going to pull you in here. So people bring different things to a team setting as well. And that means you'll have the silent watchers and you'll have the conversation holders as well. How do you manage that sort of an experience in a room where you can really bring everybody in with that unique diversity that brings that thought process that comes in?
I love that term, conversation hoarders. I'm going to steal that. I love it. What I do a lot is I usually do team sessions that are somewhere between 8 and 12 to 15 people. And so that's really almost too many to just sit at a table and talk when you have conversation hoarders, because we hear from about 10% of the people sitting at the table. One thing I've tried lately that has worked really well is, as we got our list early on things that they think they do well, or even some things they would like to do differently, we got whiteboards or flip charts, and we would write a word across the top. So one group was talking about they needed to be a bit more forgiving, a little bit more unselfish, to share responsibilities a little bit easier, to trust more, some of those, be more accepting of people, because even if we're a lovely collaborative team, there's things that people are just annoying sometimes. Even if we love them, they're annoying. So I think we put in selfish, forgiving, trust, and acceptance or something on the whiteboards. And then we got in small groups, and in groups of three, and there was 4 boards, and they had to think about the word, and we had them write a statement of how they felt the team was doing in that regard. And then they had to write one good question that they would like the team to discuss. And then they each moved to each whiteboard, so that by the end there was 4 questions and 4 statements. And things like that stimulate interesting conversation in the dynamic of team. And I think the hard part a little bit when we look at a team grid is there's a lot of information on that. And so at a broad conceptual level, we want them to be not only thinking about their own personal strengths, but broadly, and to Jillian's point, who do we pull in as good partners for us? And I think in one of the other learning series, they were talking about some of those, maybe it was Micah, who said, some of those that are at 12 and 13 and 14, they just need a little bit of spark from someone to pull on them to make them a little bit stronger for them as a group. And so that was a really interesting conversation for them to really go through the questions. I had them lead the conversation. I always say to people, the very best team session is when you aren't doing the talking. I mean, as a coach, guide when you must, but the very best are when the conversations happen without you. And so just giving them those moments to have those conversations, that was really fascinating for them to think about. That how do we forgive? How do we be a bit less selfish when you have a lot of that accountability talent and execution talent, to Jillian's point, where we're really good at getting it done. We're really good at executing, but sometimes we're really territorial, and we're upset when you step in my box. Why are you in my box? Go over in your own box. And so how do we get more collaborative and be more unselfish, or even have the conversation that I will invite you in if I need you? Any of those things that just help stimulate conversation. So I think it's just getting creative as coaches. Every team has their own special magic. So what would work for them? That just happened to work. So I might try it again. I think it's not being afraid to try some things, trust your instincts as a coach, and just little things can matter that stimulate conversation.
And the reason such a beautiful word you said was, letting them speak with each other. It's your facilitator of that conversation with them. And if they can have an eye-to-eye conversation, candid, open, transparent conversation, your job as a facilitator of that conversation is done, because now you're set the stage for that candid conversation to happen. And that's where, Jillian, my question for you is, we are facilitators too. Sometimes we can become conversation hoarders as well. How do we also manage the dynamics in that environment, that what our role as coaches, as facilitators is? What is your take on that?
I always tell people that my job is not to do the talking. I tell them that from the very beginning. So And what I say to them, now I can fill all kinds of space if you make me, but I won't let you make me, because this is you know your story better than I know your story. You know each other better than I know you. So I've listened to you. I've heard you. I've had some thoughts about your team. I have some questions that I hope you get to without my prodding, but I'll prod if you need me to. But in the end, I want you to lead the conversation with each other. And then I let them do it. I'm not afraid, though, and I don't think as coaches we should be afraid to throw some tough questions on the table if they're not. Or even in the smaller groups where we can really make them have a little bit safer space and then bring that conversation together. It's so interesting when it's coming from 3 people, it doesn't feel quite as scary as if it's coming from one, because it was a we question rather than a me question. And for a lot of teams, that just makes it a lot easier to have those conversations.
And three,
Yeah.
such an important word you said. Sorry, go ahead, Jillian.
Oh, well, I was just going to add in. I mean, I think some of this goes back to our expectation setting too, right? And it's saying what our role is at the very beginning, so that they understand, hey, we're here. Our primary objective is to serve you and this team during this time, and so we're here to kind of spark you where needed. I also think that's where your preparation process really does serve you well, because if we are mindful of having facilitative even exercises in our approach, we're setting people up for that conversation. And I'll even give just a little tip and trick that I found. Don't say this, too loud, but I learned this from an elementary school teacher, and I got to tell you, it works with adults too. But one of the things I found is that if you've got, either a space where it's feeling like, oh my goodness, no one's talking, and you're tempted to kind of just jump in and speak, for the group, or if you know that it's a group that's maybe a little more of just needs to process, I use what I call think, pair, share. And I tell you, it works every time. So you pose a couple questions and you say, I'm going to give you just a couple minutes on your own just to think about these. Jot down, what you're thinking about with it, and then pair. So pair up with a partner. Maybe this is even when you first hand out the team report, right? You put a couple questions up and you say, pair up with a partner and discuss, what are you seeing as the strengths that align with how the brand of this team shows up? Where are you seeing some of those blind spots that might match with the challenges of the group? And then all of a sudden, they're much more comfortable talking about that because they just kind of vetted it with somebody next to them when you bring it to the whole group. So that's a really simple, easy, just technique to kind of aid facilitation wherever needed as well.
And I really like that word, think, pair, and share. Therese, I know language is important to you, and people might say different words, different things in a conversation. How do you probe that think, pair, and share in that group setting about thinking about the language people are using? So how do you evoke that conversation, Therese?
I really ask them to take the time to pay attention. And I realize sometimes, you can stand to wander if there's not interesting things going on. So it's really paying attention to critical words that people use so that they really can ask people to please explain. So in just natural conversation, I've had people say, I really hate that, or I find that really intimidating, or I really struggle about how rigid that feels, or she or he feels, or that felt really caustic to me, or any of those words that people will use when they're in conversation. And when people don't notice that, I ask them to stop and to tell me back what they heard. It's so interesting where someone said that they felt really intimidated by something, and then the conversation went on, and I said, "Can we stop for a minute?" I said, "What was she really saying?" And they said, "Well, she didn't really like it." And I said, "That's really not the word she used. So think again. What did she use?" And someone said, "Intimidating." And I said, "How does that word feel to you as a group?" So I think part of our job is to just stop and help them hear, and then have a different conversation rather than discount the word. Because when people say things like, I just hate that, I hate when that happens, we should really, as a collective team, have that conversation. So how does that impact the team when you're having that kind of strong emotion around something? And what talents do we have that could maybe relieve that stress or whatever is happening to kind of have that strong emotion? So I think that's just part of our job as coaches, is to help, is be an active listener, and then to help them do the same.
And
Therese,
coaches who are listening in, sorry, go
Sarah,
ahead,
let me
Jen.
jump in really quick because I think this is important. Is you guys have both of you, Therese and Jillian, as you've been talking about these things that we do. Therese, you've been doing this for a long time with Top 5, and Jillian, you as well. And we made this jump to 34. In the title, we've said, some coaching teams using this. What's the shift that you guys have seen as we've emphasized more 34, and we've emphasized it with our clients, and we have more clients moving to 34? What are the differences you guys have seen, and have you changed anything based on having now maybe more 34 results than we had before? Therese, let's start with you.
I think we have more people, and Jillian and I were talking about this yesterday, where one of the things we have them think about is, let's think about the beauty of the top and the pain of the bottom, because that's where they go. So I always think about when I look at that 34 grid, I'm really feeling, it's almost like when you look down the street of a neighborhood and what's that broad view that you see? All the lawns look really well manicured, but there might be a few that don't look quite the same. But we want you to get that overall sense of who is this team in a broader sense than just that top 5. It's giving you a broader picture. But I think where the team always goes when we start having them look at the grid is where are our points of pain? And it's really, I try to not let them say, but we have one person who has deliberative, so they're going to save us all. They're going to stop all conversations and make us all be more deliberative. So I think the conversations just have changed a little bit, where that's really not what that one deliberative person, that's not their job. Their job is now to not make you all go, when you're having a kind of that energetic conversation, to go, okay, stop now. Everyone stop. I have deliberative. So I think we're getting much more intentional about what does it mean at the bottom? And then how do we not pluck this out and post it on somebody's forehead going, you're our deliberative person, you're our includer person, you're our, whatever. Let's think more about how do we appreciate what's at the bottom, and really think, how do we as a collective team have the talent to manage that? And not that we don't want to call on sometimes that deliberative partner, but I really want them to avoid labeling people with one big, you're our person. How about we do it different? How about we ask better questions? How about we use some of that really analytical piece that we have, whatever it is, so that we're really helping them think. It's great to pay attention to the bottom, only because we want you to value what's at the top. And that's really the more of the conversations I have now.
Kristen says in the chat room, it's not an excuse finder, kind of is what you're saying. Therese, Jillian, in your work that you're doing, as we're doing more 34s, what are you seeing out there?
Yeah, and let me just maybe even acknowledge a couple sentiments that in this coaching community, and I'm seeing it even in the class that I'm teaching this week, right? And some of it may be a fear of when people see their full 34, what are they going to do with that, right? And some of it may also be, oh, this feels like a lot of information at once, or wow, we've been talking about top 5 for a long time. What does this mean if I kind of open up this Pandora's box in a whole new world? And I think what has been a pleasant experience for me is that all of the clients that I've introduced the full 34 with have been ecstatic about it. When you're actually using it with a leader, with a manager, it's giving them so much robust information about themselves. Like I said, I think it does take some thoughtfulness in knowing when to introduce it. For me, I've done it primarily with organizations that have some exposure around strengths already. But I think there's enough of a strengths community of practice now that, all of us actually help be a bit of the regulators around how reports like that are getting used. And so, we talk about it in in our courses together. But, people are going to look at the bottom. But I think the more we're reinforcing as a community that the power's in the top, and you see that the report even pulls you there, that's where people naturally, end up going back to, is all of the rich information that they're getting in their top 5 and their top 10. They love that periodic table of elements. I mean, I will say for me, I think one of the things that it's done is it's added a richness to one-on-one conversations. Mm-hmm. I also think that for team conversations, you just see so much more when you see beyond that. And some of the practical ways that that's played out is that, as individuals think about what domain they lead with, go back to that periodic table that's on the report. I had one group that I worked with where, we literally had people kind of stand up in the middle of the team session. We were talking about, how do you handle if it's a bigger group, a smaller group? This is something that's kind of neat with a bigger group, but we actually had people, hey, look at that page of your report, right? See, what domain do you lead with? And then we made a bit of a living team grid in the room. And we had people walk to the domain that they lead with. And they got to share stories with others around them of, how they lead with that domain. And I think that kind of rich information that you get from that type of a report just creates a much deeper conversation. One other idea I'll share from what Therese shared there too is I think when you've got that full 34, even that you're looking at for a team, one of the things that's just kind of a creative thing that we've done is actually taken top 5, bottom 5 for a team, and actually said, hey, we want to introduce you to, 2 new individuals of this team. Let's talk about who these people are. And we're not even really saying that it's the top and bottom of this team yet. But what we start to do is talk about, what would this person bring to the team? What excites you about these strengths? How about these? And then after that conversation, what they start to realize is, wow, like this person's very different. And we maybe even liked person A little more because it was a lot like our strengths, and helps them start to create some awareness around, what, this is kind of who we are and how we show up. But they start to value some of those things that they get to see a little bit further down where, oh, wow, this is something that's not who we are. But we see the wonderful contribution that somebody who maybe even has that in their 6 through 10, is able to bring to this group because it's something that's a unique contribution. So it's really made that discussion much more robust.
It's led to a question in the community that when you're filling out team grids, do you do just top 5? Do you do 10? Do you do all 34, Therese? When in your experience, tell us a little bit about what's some guidance on that when filling out team grids.
So I typically find most people's brains explode when all 34 are on a team grid for all people, because unless you really truly have this brain that says, I can't imagine a world without 5,000 numbers on a grid, most people find that a bit overwhelming, especially initially. What I typically do with new teams is top 10, bottom 5, because it just gives them a pretty strong balance between the top and the bottom. And it's something they can digest because it just makes sense. Most of them have had some feedback, and especially if they've had top 5 feedback, but they've always wondered, what's my 6, 7, 8? And it's human nature to go at the bottom and go, what do you mean empathy's 34? That's not possible. I think that's probably where those conversations still have substance to them without it feeling overwhelming. What do you think, Jillian?
Yeah, and Jim, remind me the question one more time from the chat.
When we're creating a team grid, top 5.
Oh, yes.
1 through 10, all 34.
Yeah, so for me, actually very similar. My preference is not overwhelming with the full 34. And this part of this comes from input, though, that I do like to see that top 10. I do think there's something that's, I just think about even the reactions. And for those of you listening, and think about if you only see your top 5, if I only see my top 5, I feel like it's half a picture of who I am. You only see my input and learner and achiever, and you miss, my positivity and individualization and woo that I feel like kind of externally shows up and explains more of who I am. And so I think having at least that top 10 kind of allows for that within a team. So it feels like a more round picture of what people get to see. And then I think for us as coaches, if we're showing that bottom, that's where we get to kind of help guide them on how they're making sense of it. And that's the role that we can play. So that's typically what I do. as well.
Around this topic, I find as I talk to a lot of coaches all the time online with all the work that we do, they want an answer like, what's the right thing to do? And so I asked in chat here, I said, what do you guys do? And I'm getting all these varieties, right? And I think the key is, and I think what we like to think is, what are you best coaching at? Like, what are you comfortable with? What works for you? And then I think, Teresa, probably you had this experience too, where some groups, you know them better than others.
Absolutely.
And so you kind of customize it, right? You kind of say, okay, we're going to, Jillian, same with you. We're going to change this. Sarav, I'm sure you're doing this as well. We're going to kind of modify this because I know this group needs this. And I'm just afraid if we start getting too prescriptive on, no, it's always top 5 or it's always all 34, we miss the point. Jillian, you're shaking your head up and down like
I am. I think it's a really good point. And, we speak from our own frames of reference. And so for me, a lot of the clients that I'm working with are clients who have some sort of strengths exposure already. And so they're kind of primed and ready for this. But I can also see the merit for some folks who, like you said, maybe you're just more comfortable as a coach starting with top 5, or for organizations where this is really a new concept. I'm thinking about, organizations that maybe even have very low engagement, and you can kind of sense that in the culture, and they might actually use that full 34 report for evil rather than for good. Then maybe it's appropriate to start with just top 5 and have it be a bit of a progression, for folks over that journey. So there's not a right or wrong answer. It really is, what's right for your specific situation.
Okay, lightning round question, and then we're going to throw it back to Sarah because we're going to run out of time. Does coaching on all 34 or working with teams on all 34 add time to the sessions? Does it take longer because there's more information? Teresa, I'll go back to you and give you that question. Longer? Yes or no?
No.
Jillian, yes or no?
How's that?
No, give us a little bit of. Sorry, I shouldn't have said lightning.
I'm gonna qualify my answers. No, if they have had a chance to interact with the report beforehand.
Yes.
Teresa,
If they're
you want to add
interacting
anything?
with it for the first time, it can take a little time.
It's absolutely right. I mean, if we've done all of our due diligence around having conversations with people, understanding the manager, understanding the team, whether we know 10 or 34, we're still going to spend the time we need with the team.
Awesome. Sarah, I'll throw it back to you.
Thank you, Jim. And again, just for all the coaches listening in, I hope you've really documented a lot of wonderful insight. But Therese and Julian have sort of shared with us some ideas, some practical tips. One thing I'd share is think about what Therese and Julian both alluded to. They've been using the word coaches, that we are coaches and not just facilitators. And that's what, to the point earlier is that coaches, are active listeners. They're tuned in and they're passengers in that journey. So sometimes, we as facilitators can be directive of here's where I want to take this group to, versus we are in an exploratory mode. We're going on a journey with them, and it's more of their journey. So asking great questions, opening conversation, letting them talk with each other. Those are key insights that I've actually captured from both of these wonderful coaches as well. So think about your role as a coach, as a facilitator, as a conversation builder in that group setting to really get them to an outcome. And I say a successful session with any leader, with any group, applies with the whole Bloom's taxonomy concept of that whole know, feel, and do. What the people coming into the room with, what do they know, and what journey you're taking them on for them to know differently post that session, and what do they feel before coming in towards each other, towards this concept of strengths philosophy, and how are you helping them on that journey of knowing and feeling differently. And again, finally is actions. Without actions, nothing changes. So what are they currently doing as a team, and what would you want them to do differently post this session? So I think about, as a coach, how would you create that experiential journey for the participants in a room? And that, you can keep talking about things and people will forget what you tell them in 60 days time. They'll even forget what they tell you back in 90 days time, but people don't forget how you make them feel. So think about the experiences that you create with them. So all I'd say is, thank you to both masterful coaches, Jillian and Therese, for your wonderful, insightful information for all of us. I've learned a ton from you. And all the coaches, don't forget, those ICF credits, live attendees. This session is worth one core competency, CCE hour from ICF. Watch for the event evaluation in your inbox on Friday. Make your opinions heard. On the evaluation, you will be asked to indicate which sessions you attended, either live or via the recording. And we love to hear feedback. We all constantly looking to improve and add more value to you coaches. I think because this is a strengths mission we are on to really make a difference and make genuine impact to the world. And the best way we do it is a collective community of growing together as a united with for a common mission, which is changing the world for better. If you're watching the recorded version, you can earn one resource development hour as well from ICF. We do hope you join us tomorrow for our last session in the series. We will share our recommendations of things you can do to continue to grow as Clifton Strengths coaches as well. Therese, Jillian, thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us. And thank you for being part of the Gallup coaching community. Goodbye for now. Thank you.